Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. Our daily news feeds are often dominated by the latest tragic developments from active conflicts around the world. However, due to the nature and limitations of mainstream media, far less attention is given to other high-stakes situations. Tensions that, while not yet erupting into open conflict, carry the potential for serious global consequences and often go underreported. One such area where grey zone activity escalates tensions on a daily basis is the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan Strait is a 180-kilometre wide body of international water that separates the island nation of Taiwan from the Asian continent. It lies between the East and South China Seas in the northwestern Pacific Ocean. The grey zone activities in the Taiwan Strait are carried out by the People's Liberation Army, the military wing of the Chinese Communist Party, who rule the neighbouring People's Republic of China. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, claim Taiwan as part of their sovereign territory and have vowed to unify Taiwan with the mainland by force if necessary. However, it's important to note that the CCP, who were founded in 1921 and who took control of the PRC in 1949, have never in their entire existence occupied or controlled Taiwan. Taiwan has its own democratically elected government and is home to over 23 million people. And while political leaders have differing views on relations with China, public opinion surveys consistently indicate that Taiwanese people feel more closely aligned with Taiwan than with the PRC. Cross-strait tensions have escalated in recent years as China has rapidly ramped up its military capabilities and conducted more complex and intrusive operations around Taiwan. Since 2016, Taiwan's presidential leaders have come from the Democratic Progressive Party, which does not view the island as part of a unified China, a departure from the position of the previous Chinese Nationalist Party or Kuomintang-led government. When it comes to relations with the United States, the US had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan from 1954 to 1979. The Nixon administration moved to normalize ties with the PRC in the 1970s, and in 1979, the Carter administration followed through on this policy, severing diplomatic relations and the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan, and establishing formal diplomatic relations with the PRC. At the same time, the US Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which has since governed the United States' unofficial relationship with Taiwan. Under the Act, the United States has maintained a robust unofficial relationship with Taiwan and continues to sell defense equipment to its military, making Taiwan one of the United States' top arms buyers, a position that raises strong objections from Beijing. Although US foreign policy maintains the ability to come to Taiwan's defense while not actually committing to doing so, an approach known as strategic ambiguity, the US says its chief goal is to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Recently, President Donald Trump said that the Chinese leader Xi Jinping told him he will not invade Taiwan while Trump is in office. So how then should we view the risks associated with the ongoing tensions in the Taiwan Strait? My guest in this episode of Perspectives with Neilo is Bill Emmott. He's a writer, journalist, and former editor-in-chief of The Economist. He's also the author of the 2024 book, Deterrence, Diplomacy, and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. And I was fortunate to meet up with him on the sidelines of the McGill Summer School in July. My first question was why we in Ireland and Western Europe should care about what's going on thousands of kilometres away in Taiwan.
I think there are really two reasons why we should care about what's going on in Taiwan. The big, mega reason, if you like, is that this risks bringing the two great nuclear superpowers of the world, the United States and China, into direct military conflict with one another. China clearly wants to take over Taiwan or to get control of it. The United States wants to prevent that being done involuntarily, but also does not want China to dominate that region of the world militarily because of the sea lanes that go through it and because since 1945 America has kept that area open and has its own forces in various places. So the risk is, if an invasion attempt happened, that it could escalate into a genuine world war between superpowers. The second reason, quickly, is that this is a potential colonial occupation of Taiwan. A lot of people don't realize that Taiwan historically was not part of mainland China. If by historically you talk about the last 600, 700, 800 years. It's only been formally part of mainland China since the 1690s, and indeed utterly formally only since the early 1890s, and then was handed over to Japan after a conflict between China and Taiwan, and in the treaty it was handed to Japan. So Taiwan's status has been as an independent country, but then with colonial powers, one of which is China, others of which have been Japan and Spain and Portugal in the past, seeking to take it over. So we should understand it as a colonial occupation issue for the Taiwanese people, who now are a democracy.
And to go back to the danger here of bringing the two superpowers into nuclear conflict, I mean, China is quite explicit in its claim on Taiwan, but US is often ambiguous. And given these particular days we find ourselves in recently with US uncertainty and so on, do you think the US will come to Taiwan's aid if they need it?
I think it will. The answer to that may change with each new president, with each new commander-in-chief, and that's one of the sources of uncertainty. There is not a consistent position. What we have from the US is a consistent commitment under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 to supply or to sell arms to Taiwan to enable it to keep up its defenses. We do not have explicit commitments about whether or not they will intervene. Why not? Because historically the US has not wished to give Taiwan an incentive to declare formal independence and thereby risk provoking a Chinese invasion. So Taiwan is currently in a kind of limbo, in a kind of purgatory situation, but a pleasant purgatory, but a purgatory. And actually, American ambiguity is about keeping it in that limbo situation and not giving it a false incentive to feel secure enough to declare full independence and thereby provoke a war. So we will always be uncertain about this. President Biden in 2021 and 2022, because of a worry that the Russian invasion of Ukraine might coincide with or lead to a similar operation by China with Taiwan, President Biden chose to make an explicit commitment to defend Taiwan 4 times during that period. His successor, President Trump, has not made any such commitment.
Yeah, he's been quite explicit in saying he won't say anything, right?
That's right, exactly. Yeah. So he's returned to the position of ambiguity.
Yeah. And why is Taiwan important to the US?
I think Taiwan is important to the US principally for reasons of maritime strategy. In other words, because its location geographically provides a control over the South China Sea and the East China Sea, which means the whole of the Western Pacific, running from Japan in the northern part of that, right down past the Philippines down to Indonesia.
Part of the first island chain.
What's called the first island chain, exactly. Yeah. And Taiwan going into Chinese hands would provide them with a de facto kind of control over that region and would enable them also then to put pressure on the Philippines and Japan. A secondary reason, and it's not morally secondary, but I mean, let's be realistic about this. A secondary reason is that Taiwan is a democracy. Taiwan has, in a painful way, moved from a dictatorship in the post-war period to become a democracy starting in the mid-80s, but then formally speaking in 1996. It's a flourishing democracy. For it to go into the hands of a dictatorship would be a huge hit to American values and to the idea of the free world. Now, presidents vary in how much they care about that issue. I don't think Donald Trump cares about that very much, but Joe Biden absolutely did. And future presidents may well come back to caring about that.
So that's why America, the US, this is why they care about Taiwan. You alluded to it there, and it might be obvious to people who understand the region, but for those who are maybe not as familiar with the region, why is it important to China? Why is Taiwan important to China?
I think Taiwan's important to China because it wishes to control the area inside the first island chain. So strategically, it wants to control all the sea area around its borders, as it has sought to control the land area around its borders by, for example, taking possession of Tibet in the 1950s, which again had a clear historical role as part of China, but Mao Zedong decided that he had to get Tibet to protect China in the Himalayas. So I think modern China, with a more capable navy and a more strong military, want to control the sea area around China as well, as it were, a superpower they think should be entitled to do. Secondarily, it is an unfinished civil war. Taiwan was occupied by the losing side in the Chinese Civil War, by Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, who lost to the communists in 1949, went into exile in Taiwan, officially maintained a claim to be the legitimate government of China, and indeed occupied the Chinese seat in the Security Council, Security Council of the United Nations until 1973, until the Nixon opening to China that happened. So that it is in a way the conclusion to an unfinished civil war, and from a Chinese point of view, it also is a conclusion to a war with Japan that concluded in 1895 with the handing over of Taiwan to Japan. So getting Taiwan back would end a historical wrong as far as the Chinese government is concerned.
And we've seen China, they execute almost daily incursions now into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Yes. They send their navy all around the island. But we've seen some major operations by them, simulating blockades in the last couple of years, since Lai Ching-te has become president. And the thing about these blockades is that it's not a kinetic physical invasion. It's something different. Does that make it more difficult for an ally like the US to come to Taiwan's aid? And is it a way to fudge an invasion? What do you think of that whole potential scenario around China's mechanism to take control of Taiwan?
Well, personally, I would, trying to think from a Chinese military point of view and the political leadership point of view, I would think that a blockade was the likelier method to try, because failing with a very difficult and costly direct military invasion would be a disaster for the political leadership. So a blockade and coercion is something you can more easily retreat from, and use it and say maybe it's the beginning of a phase rather than a one-off. So I think it's the likelier one. It is the more difficult one for the US to respond to. Legally, in terms of the laws of war, a blockade can be considered tantamount to a declaration of war, but it's very unclear what's the definition of a blockade. So it would put the onus on the US to decide how to deal with this. Now, we've got precedents with the Berlin airlift in the Cold War, with an effective blockade on West Berlin, on West Berlin inside East Germany, being responded to with a dramatic and gestural, if you like, response by NATO, by the West. So a blockade, it's possible to respond to a blockade, and it's possible to respond to a blockade with counter-blockades on Chinese routes of supply. So it's not that there's no response, but it definitely puts the onus onto the US to respond. And second advantage from China's point of view, I think, is that it could put neighboring countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines especially, into more of a quandary about where they stand on this, and who they support.
Yeah, and they're also facing some of this Chinese, aggression in recent years, particularly the Philippines and maybe to some extent also Japan. Are they changing their attitudes or positions towards China? And how does this all fold into Taiwan's, situation?
Well, I think the Philippines and Japan have definitely hardened their attitudes towards China, taken the threat more seriously, and decided that they need to strengthen their militaries in response and cooperate with one another as well as with the United States. So the Philippines, under the current president, has opened up a lot of logistical bases in the Philippines for potential American use in the event of need, which means a conflict over Taiwan, for example, which they hadn't been doing before, but now they've decided they need to show the Chinese that they mean business. They've also been in confrontation daily with China over possession of certain parts of the South China Sea. Japan has been supplying them with vessels, with Coast Guard vessels and others, and seeking to get common cause with them. But finally now Japan is building up its own military for the first time really since, the first time in an overt way since the Second World War, because they feel very consciously a Chinese threat and that they need to be part of the deterrence of that threat.
Here at the McGill Summer School, you've been talking on some of the panels. Very interesting discussion on China, Europe, and Ireland relations the last day. One of the things you said about China's claim on Taiwan back in that panel discussion was that China's claim on Taiwan is weaker than the previous British claim on Ireland, which brings the... For people who are not as familiar with what's going on over in East Asia, it certainly brings things closer to home in terms of understanding the picture. Can you tell us a little bit more about that statement?
Well, the reason I make that statement is because I think big part of the Chinese narrative, which we can call propaganda, but anyway, the narrative, is the notion that Taiwan has always been part of China, and what China simply wants to do is to return to the status quo, to return to the norm, which is Taiwan being part of China, as if this was like Hong Kong, which had been, if you're at least away from China, and indeed subject to British colonial kind of possession in the previous centuries. The truth about Taiwan is more complicated and different from that, which is that Taiwan was an independent nation, very often, dominated in its population by actually Aboriginal peoples originally from Polynesia and other places, and gradually settled, often against Chinese will, by Chinese from the mainland who were trying to escape problems in the mainland, and then occupied partially by Spain and by Portugal.
And the Dutch.
And the Dutch, rather. The Dutch, yes. Yes, exactly. Portugal, so by European colonial powers, and then finally kind of dominated by China only from 1690s onwards. So I want just to point out to this Irish audience that this is a recent historical claim. You can take it for what it is, but compare that recent historical claim of essentially 200 years of possession with the British historical claim, if you like, no longer fortunately being made to Ireland, which was 800 years of occupation. Now, no one would take seriously a British view saying that Ireland had been an inalienable part of Britain or England or whatever we were to call it since ancient times. But what China tries to say is Taiwan has been an inalienable part of China since ancient times. Ancient times actually is 1693.
I suppose another thing that maybe weakens their claim is that the British Empire has been around for a long time. But the Chinese Communist Party has only been around since 1921, I believe, didn't come to power till 1949, and nowhere in any of that time have they occupied or controlled Taiwan.
That's right. Though Taiwan has never been part of communist China, it was briefly part of nationalist China when the Japanese lost the Second World War and retreated in 1945. So for 4 years, it was, legally speaking, the Republic of China, which was being run by the Kuomintang from the mainland. But then with the Civil War, that changed. So yes, it's never actually been part of China. But we must understand and respect that China would like it to be part of China, but not be fooled into thinking that this is other than really a colonial aspiration.
We hear more from commentators and analysts these days that an invasion or a takeover, an annexation of Taiwan is more likely. We know that I think Xi Jinping has told the PLA to be ready by 2027 being the 100th anniversary of the PLA. What are your thoughts on the timing of a potential annexation?
Well, I think that there's no real dates attached to this. What has become attached to it is the growing theoretical capability of the PLA, and that is what Xi Jinping has sought to invest in and to make sure is there, a capability both as a global military force and more specifically in terms of the theatre of operations that would come into play in an invasion of Taiwan. And that is what has the 2027 kind of deadline attached to it. Get ready. Is this becoming likelier or not? I actually don't particularly think it's becoming likelier unless America made it seem as if it would stand out of the way and that there was a once, perhaps and forever, opportunity for Xi Jinping to take it while the Americans were willing to let it be taken. That is more than a zero possibility, because Donald Trump clearly has an instinctive sympathy for like spheres of influence, geopolitics, the idea that America should dominate North America and the Americas have Canada, have Greenland, and so forth. Russia perhaps should dominate its bit of Eurasia, as it's tried to do with Ukraine. It's conceivable that Donald Trump might decide that rather than fighting China, he should just allow China to have that sphere of influence. And it's conceivable that China might think he's doing that and then make a miscalculation and attempt it and then find that he actually didn't want to accept it. So that's why I think that the risk of conflict is high. The risk of a serious conflict arising out of what many people who don't pay attention to it might think, oh, this is just a local issue between two regional countries. Why I think it could become a global conflict, and really a very serious one, even nuclear, is because I think the potential of a miscalculation by Xi Jinping of the Americans, whether under Trump or a successor, is the thing I worry about most. I basically don't think that Xi Jinping is a risk taker in military terms, in the way that Vladimir Putin clearly is a risk taker and is prepared to endure huge losses of personnel and huge setbacks in his efforts in order to achieve or prove his point in some way. I don't see that in Xi Jinping. I hope I'm right. So I think that actually his taste for taking a risk is low, but he could become tempted.
Okay. The title of your latest book is Deterrence Diplomacy and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. Let me ask you about that deterrence in diplomacy in terms of what the rest of the world maybe should be doing more of to create that deterrence, given the impact of a potential conflict. What's your suggestions there?
Well, I think that the biggest form of deterrence is the sense that the likely cost of a conflict to China is high and going higher. The military capability idea we were talking about just now might suggest it's going down because they're getting more capable. The deterrence the role of deterrence is to alter that calculation and make it clear that the Japanese forces are getting stronger as well, that America has deployable forces close by, that the bases in the Philippines are there, that planes could come from Korea, from the American military bases there, and from Japan, from Okinawa, and that actually the risks that are being taken are unacceptably high. So the principal deterrence is military. The second level of that is political will. I think that the biggest temptation towards a miscalculation would be if the Chinese leadership concluded that the will to defend Taiwan was declining and it was not really there, which can come from neighboring countries essentially giving up on Taiwan, or it could come more seriously from the United States. And I think that continuously confirming that political will, the seriousness with which we take Taiwan, is an important element of deterring China from making a mistake, making a really dangerous move. Diplomacy is about reassuring them that there's not going to be an imposed independence, rather that we just don't want anyone to use military force to change this. If the Taiwanese people decided that they wished to join China, there is absolutely no reason why anyone in the West or anywhere else, in Japan or anywhere else, should stand in their way, and that would be wrong. So we have to reassure China that they can argue the case, but they just mustn't do it with missiles.
And they should, if they want to do that, I suppose, do it fairly as well. It should be a free and fair decision for the population of Taiwan.
Yes, exactly. And the danger of the blockade type tactic is that it becomes an unfair process, that there's a form of coercion. And you see that already in some of the efforts that China is doing to incursions into Taiwanese airspace to make Taiwanese people and the international community see Taiwan as a non-viable entity economically and politically. I don't think that that's succeeding yet, but a serious blockade, a serious coercion that made Taiwan feel unviable could be the precursor then to a persuasion effect that says, come on, vote to join us or else.
Well, let's hope it doesn't get to that, Bill. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for sharing all your insights with us.
It's been great to be with you, Neil. Thank you.
That's Bill Emmott, who is a writer, journalist and former editor of The Economist and chair of London-based think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's also author of the book Deterrence, Diplomacy and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. He was speaking with me during the McGill Summer School in Glenties, County Donegal, earlier in July. My sincere thanks to Bill for sharing his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Neilo. While our interview focused mostly on Taiwan's relationship with China, China's grey warfare activities in the region are by no means limited to the Taiwan Strait. We've previously reported on China's aggression against the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea, and how the Chinese Communist Party does not adhere to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or recognise the 2016 ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which denied Beijing's claims to this area. Tensions have flared in the recent past when there have been skirmishes and near misses between the Philippines and the PLA in the skies and seas around Scarborough Shoal. As recently as August 11th, a Chinese Coast Guard cutter crashed headlong into a Chinese PLA destroyer while chasing a smaller Philippine Coast Guard vessel. The whole episode was caught on video by the Philippines Coast Guard and serves to illustrate how China's illegal and aggressive behaviour increases the likelihood of skirmishes, which could raise the risk of inadvertent use of kinetic force and the far-reaching consequences that could affect us all. Before departing on a recent trip to the region, German Foreign Minister Johann Wedeful was quoted as saying, "China's increasingly aggressive behaviour in the Taiwan Strait, East and South China Seas also has implications for us in Europe. Fundamental principles of global coexistence are at stake here." There are, of course, many other important reasons why we should all care about Taiwan. For example, its crucial role in the global semiconductor supply chain, its status as a democratic society, its vibrant culture, and so on. These are topics for future episodes, so if you enjoy this kind of content and wish to support us, be sure to like, follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, we've linked some recent articles and information, including Bill Emmett's Substack, in the Dive Deeper section of our blog, which you can find at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. There you'll also find all of our past episodes and links to our social media pages. Be sure to leave us a comment and let us know your feedback. But that's where we leave it for now. As always, thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán ag Spanacht.